So, considering the fact that recently I did mention that I wanted to do some updates on some of the Olympians from 2016, I figure there's no better time than to talk a little bit about Claressa Shields, especially considering the fact that coming up in a couple of days here, she's going to be fighting against. Actually, shoot, this is going to be tomorrow. Tomorrow she's going to be fighting against Nikki Adler for the WBC Middleweight title, female edition, and the IBF female super middleweight title. The IBF one being vacant, the WBC actually being held by Adler, who is currently 16-0. Um, First off, I'm just going to touch a little bit on Claressa Shields' overall career before I talk about her upcoming fight against Nikki Adler. Claressa Shields won an Olympic gold medal back in 2012 at the tender age of 17. She managed to repeat that, winning a gold medal once again in 2016. Had a very, very good amateur career. Wound up, I think she only had one loss her entire amateur career, and she actually avenged that once or twice, I believe, against the female that actually defeated her. And once again, the fact that she was so young to begin with, it's no surprise that she may have, picked up a loss along the way, when she might have been 15 or 16 and fighting, basically fully grown women. Claressa Shields is a little bit of a prodigy in that sense. Not necessarily unlike what you might see in other women's sports. Sometimes it seems like the females tend to be able to kind of peak a little bit earlier than in with males against, you'll very rarely see male athletes, at 16, 17, 18, being able to compete against like their older peers who, you know, uh, for lack of a better term, basically have their man strength. When you get into like your mid 20s and your musculature and your skeleton is a lot more fully grown and fully developed and everything, and the leverages just kind of work out a bit better. Like I think probably one of the best examples of that is Tommy Hearns. Compare Tommy Hearns when he was an amateur to Tommy Hearns as a pro. It's like a night and day difference with that lights out power that he managed to eventually develop. But Claressa Shields has done a pretty damn good job for herself as a pro as well. Pretty much coming out of the Olympics, I felt like she was going to rise fast and be able to pretty much get a title shot and probably win it whenever she chose, or whenever her promoters chose, basically, to finally put her in there against the best. Because with female boxing in particular, generally the best have largely kind of come from the amateurs in a large part. Especially in other countries, where their athletes tend to be basically like pros that are sponsored by the state. Oftentimes you'll find fighters staying as amateurs for a good long time, like Katie Taylor, for instance, out of Ireland. But Claressa Shields, of course, she's looking to kind of take the bull by the horns and try to become like the new kind of like Layla Ali slash Ann Wolf slash what was that woman's name? I'm forgetting her name now. She had fought Layla Ali, the farmer's daughter. I can't, or the coal miner's daughter rather, the coal miner's daughter. It'll come to me, but basically looking to capitalize on, somewhat of like I guess the niche of female fighters in general, female boxers in particular, and just kind of cross over in a certain fashion. Christy Martin was the coal miner's daughter. She was another one that was able to kind of capitalize. Mia St. John as well, Lucia Riker. The females that were able to actually, make a pretty good, solid living for themselves as professional boxers, and in a way, kind of models for, I guess, young women everywhere in terms of being able to kind of follow your passion, as it were. Kind of live that romantic life, so to speak, following your passion through to its end. But of course, getting back to her actual pro career, she had a pretty tough first fight against Franchon Cruz, a female that she had fought a few times as an amateur. They knew each other pretty well in terms of like stylistically speaking, and Franchon Cruz gave her a pretty good fight. Franchon Cruz, you could tell that she was a fairly strong woman herself. Definitely much older than Shields, probably a little bit more developed in that sense of being more used to, I guess, like her adult body, as it were. And she at the very least kind of pushed Shields, although Shields pretty handily won the fight. Of course, only a 4-round fight, but I thought, fairly handily won it. Was just cleaner technically, definitely landed the cleaner punches. In spite of the fact that Cruz had a bit of a reach advantage, it looked like, Shields was just able to put her punches together a bit better. Very, very good on the inside. In spite of the fact that she has kind of short arms for her height, her alias is actually T-Rex because of that reason. She's managed to work it out pretty well for herself. She doesn't necessarily have outright knockout power, but Shields is a very strong fighter. She has a lot of physical strength to her, and coupled with the high volume that she tends to throw, it's going to be a very difficult thing to deal with strategically. Her second fight against Silvia Sabados. Sabados was a fighter out of Hungary who normally tends to campaign at welterweight or light middleweight. With the female divisions, they're not quite as talent rich, as talent deep. Whereas in the men's divisions, especially as you're heading towards middleweight, you'll find thousands or tens of thousands of ranked boxers. Ranked currently active boxers. With the females, it's very, very, very much smaller in terms of the talent pool generally. So Sabados basically kind of took the opportunity. And Claressa Shields took advantage of a smaller woman coming up in weight and pretty much beat her down. Stopped her in the 4th round of 6, and then went on to the next fight against Sydney LeBlanc, where she scored another pretty dominant decision, 8-round dominant decision over LeBlanc, who herself only had 1 loss previously. And that pretty much got Shields basically ready for this fight that she has coming up against Nikki Adler, the WBC champion. I have managed to see a little bit of footage of Adler. She's a fighter out of Germany, orthodox stance fighter. She's about the same height as Shields, maybe a little bit taller, a bit of a longer reach. But Adler isn't necessarily especially quick, nor would I say she's especially strong. She doesn't have a tremendous amount of snap on her punch. She's a pretty rugged fighter for what it's worth, or at the very least, for what it's worth in terms of female boxing. And she's a fighter that seems, from what I've seen of her and the footage that I've seen of her, to basically kind of outlast her opponents. She's able to kind of just cardiovascularly outwork and slowly break down her opponents over a bit of a longer fight, and either get a pretty clear-cut decision victory over them, or in certain instances be able to knock them out. Not necessarily a huge puncher. She only has 9 knockouts in 16 fights, but at the same time, especially in women's boxing, where you don't necessarily see as many straight up just one-shot KOs like that. That's a fairly good average for knockouts compared to the number of wins that she's managed to attain so far. But all that said, I do think that Shields is still just the best fighter. The best female fighter probably in the world. She's a pretty dominant force as far as I'm concerned from what I've seen of her. It's going to be very difficult for somebody, I think, to be able to match her just physically speaking. In that way, it kind of reminds me of Ann Wolfe and Layla Ali, where in both of their cases, independently of the two of them trying to fight each other, Ann Wolfe was definitely clamoring for that fight with Ali for a very long time. And of course, Wolfe's only loss was to Valerie Mahfoud, and she avenged that loss, I think, at least a couple of times, if I'm remembering correctly. I may be wrong, though. It's been a while since I actually looked at the record, but she was her and Ali in particular. They tended to be very dominant for what they were. Especially at super middleweight, where the talent pool tends to be thin. In women's boxing, it tends to be thin as it is, but especially as you kind of go higher in weight, it tends to thin out even more so. Because by that time, you're not really finding women with just all that lean mass to be able to make those weights. Usually, they'd be able to drop a bit of fat and still be able to make whatever weight may have been lower, even if they're a naturally fairly large woman. They'd usually be able to still make, welterweight, for instance. Like Christy Martin, the aforementioned Christy Martin, or like Mia St. John, eventually. But, Shields, I think, she has a pretty good future in front of her. She's still very young, 22. She definitely has probably a pretty good number of years ahead of her, for as long as she pretty much chooses the box. I think there's definitely some good opportunities out there for her, as far as possible endorsements and things of that nature. Of course, she's promoted by Dimitri Salita, former fighter himself from Salita Promotions. Managed to kind of take her on. They have a couple of fighters under their roster, that are definitely some people to look out for. Jarrell Miller, for instance. Um, and I think that with Shields, like I said before, they're kind of trying to capitalize on a bit of a niche. And in a way, I wouldn't necessarily be surprised to see Shields actually wind up fighting a lot of female mixed martial artists. Incidentally, I could very well see her almost in the with especially with kind of a lot of the hype and the clamoring that's going on around Floyd Mayweather versus Conor McGregor coming up fairly soon. I could very easily see somebody like Chris Cyborg or some of the other female UFC fighters crossing over or crossing back over to boxing and trying to fight Claressa Shields, because I would imagine that there's a pretty good chance they may be able to earn more money boxing than they would in the UFC, even though the UFC has actually done pretty well for themselves in terms of making for a good paid model for the females at the very least. Generally female fighters fight for very, very meager sums. Um, but in the UFC, with especially with the rise of Ronda Rousey, and then of course kind of even after she lost, in spite of the fallout from that loss, some of the female fighters, the female champions of the UFC, have managed to make some pretty good purses, a lot more than one might otherwise think, or at the very least more than most female fighters in general, in boxing or otherwise, have been able to make pretty much since Layla Ali. Of course, largely thanks to her name, and of course thanks to her being able to capitalize off of that name and off of the greater fame and attention that that name brought to her and to her fights. So Shields, hopefully she'll be able to kind of capitalize on the potential there. And honestly, I think the sky's kind of the limit for her. Competitively wise, I really don't see very many people being able to kind of deal with her. It's very rare where you see somebody, I think, that has her particular attributes. So it's very hard for me to imagine another female fighter almost being a bit of like a freak of nature in that sense, of being able to kind of deal with her in the physical sense. Because while I do think that there are definitely female boxers that are more skilled than Shields, I think that she would be able to more than make up for any gap that she has skill-wise against a lot of the other female fighters that would potentially come up from lower weight classes, or of course crossover from MMA, because Shields has managed to prove it again and again, in the Olympics and the amateurs, and looking to do so in the pros as well. That she's a very, very tough cookie. She's somebody that's just she's out there to win it. She's out there to win every round, and she has that mentality like she's gonna tear into you. She has that do or die mentality, and that's kind of what has kept her winning so far, and is why I think that she'll probably be winning fairly well into the future. At least as long as her passion for the sport holds up, which it generally seems to show no signs of slowing down in that regard. So that is going to do it for this one. I'll, of course, wind up reviewing the fight after the fact, and we'll see how Shields does, see if she gets herself her first world title. So that's going to do it for this one. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.